December 7th, 1944. The small village of Bastogne, Belgium, lay under a blanket of pristine snow, its cobblestone streets barely visible beneath the white powder as dawn broke across the frozen landscape. In a modest stone cottage on the outskirts of town, Marie Dupont placed another log on the fire, convinced that the worst of the war had passed them by and that the American soldiers who had arrived weeks earlier would ensure their safety through the coming winter. She had no way of knowing that within days her life would be forever changed by a chance encounter with an American Marine whose presence in Europe defied all military convention. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true story of how a single act of kindness during the chaos of war would span decades and continents, challenging the boundaries of race, duty, and what it means to keep a promise in a world torn apart by conflict. Marie adjusted her woolen scarf as she stepped out into the frigid morning air. At 22 years old, she had already experienced more tragedy than most would in a lifetime. The German occupation had taken her husband during its early days, and her parents had fled east toward Luxembourg when the fighting intensified. She remained behind to protect their family home, a stubborn decision that many in the village questioned, but none dared challenge. The arrival of American forces in September had brought a cautious optimism to Bastogne. For the first time in years, children played openly in the streets, and the constant fear that had become as much a part of daily life as breathing began to subside. The Americans had established a command post in the town center, repurposing the old municipal building with its distinctive clock tower. Supply trucks rumbled through the narrow streets daily, bringing food, medicine, and the bizarre luxury of chewing gum, which the soldiers distributed to wide-eyed children who had never seen such a thing. Marie had kept her distance from the Americans, not out of fear but from a deep-seated wariness that had become her shield against further disappointment. She had learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous indulgence in wartime. On this particular morning, Marie was heading to the small market that had reopened near the town square. Her carefully rationed supplies were running dangerously low, and the promise of fresh bread had lured her from the relative warmth of her cottage. The journey normally took 15 minutes, but the deep snow and treacherous ice extended her walk significantly. As she rounded the corner near St. Peter's Church, she nearly collided with a group of American soldiers emerging from the ancient stone building. "Pardon, madame," one of them said in awkwardly pronounced French, tipping his helmet. Marie nodded curtly and moved to continue on her way when something unusual caught her attention. Among the group of white soldiers stood a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a Marine uniform that seemed oddly out of place among the army fatigues surrounding him. Marine Sergeant William Jackson stood a full head taller than most of the army personnel around him. At 26 years old, he had already served 4 years in the United States Marine Corps, a distinction made all the more remarkable by the fact that the Marines had only begun accepting black recruits in 1942, after more than 165 years of excluding them. Jackson had been among the first to enlist after the change in policy, transferred from the Army, where he had already served for 2 years. "Sergeant Jackson is on special assignment," Captain Robert Miller explained, noticing Marie's curious glance. "He's helping coordinate supplies for the upcoming push. Best damn logistics man in the European theater." Jackson nodded respectfully toward Marie, but remained silent, his expression revealing nothing of the complex reality behind his presence in Bastogne. The truth was far more complicated than Captain Miller's simple explanation. Sergeant William Jackson was among a select group of black Marines serving in specialized roles in Europe, despite the official policy keeping most black Marines in segregated units in the Pacific. His exceptional abilities with logistics and supply chain management had earned him this unusual posting, though the assignment remained largely unacknowledged in official channels. Marie continued on her way to the market, but found her thoughts returning to the unusual sight of the black Marine throughout the day. Growing up in rural Belgium, she had rarely encountered people of different races, and never an American Negro in military uniform. There was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity that had struck her even in that brief encounter. It was only later that she would learn how truly remarkable his presence in Bastogne was. The market that day was better stocked than it had been in months. American supply lines had brought an abundance of canned goods, flour, and even some chocolate, a treasure Marie had not tasted since before the occupation. As she carefully selected what her meager funds would allow, an explosion suddenly rocked the town square, sending people diving for cover and produce tumbling from market stalls. "Aircraft!" someone shouted in French, and Marie looked up to see the distinctive silhouettes of German planes passing overhead. The Americans had warned that the German forces might attempt a counteroffensive, but few in Bastogne had believed it would come so soon or with such ferocity. Marie found herself frozen in place as others ran for shelter. The second explosion came even closer, shattering the windows of a building across the square and sending deadly shards of glass flying in all directions. She felt a sharp pain in her leg and looked down to see a piece of glass protruding from her calf, blood already soaking through her woolen stockings. "You need to move, Ma'am," a deep voice said firmly, and Marie looked up to find herself staring into the face of Sergeant William Jackson. Without waiting for her response, he scooped her into his arms and carried her toward the nearest shelter, the cellar entrance of a nearby bakery. The proprietor was ushering people inside, and Jackson ducked through the low doorway with Marie still in his arms. "Set her down here," the baker said in French, pointing to a wooden bench along the stone wall. The cellar was quickly filling with townspeople seeking refuge from the attack. Jackson gently placed Marie on the bench and knelt to examine her injury. "I need light," he said, his French surprisingly good though heavily accented. Someone handed him a kerosene lamp, and he carefully assessed the glass shard in Marie's leg. "This needs to come out," he said, looking up at her with eyes that conveyed both confidence and concern. "It will hurt, but leaving it will be worse, do you understand?" Marie nodded, gritting her teeth. "Do what you must." Sergeant Jackson removed a small first aid kit from his pocket, standard issue for all Marines, though this one had been supplemented with additional supplies that spoke to his preparedness. With steady hands that belied the chaos unfolding above them, he extracted the glass shard in one swift motion, immediately applying pressure to the wound with a clean bandage. "You were fortunate," he said as he worked. "The glass missed any major vessels. Still, you'll need this properly cleaned and dressed once the bombing stops." Marie studied his face as he concentrated on bandaging her leg. His features were strong and defined, with a prominent brow and cheekbones that caught the shadowy light of the cellar. A small scar ran along his left jawline, and she found herself wondering about its origin. "You speak French well," she said, partly to distract herself from the pain and partly out of genuine curiosity. A hint of a smile crossed his face. "My grandmother was from Haiti. She refused to speak English at home, said her French was the one thing the world couldn't take from her." He secured the bandage with practiced efficiency. "I'm William Jackson." "Marie Dupont," she replied, extending her hand in the formal Belgian manner despite the circumstances. "Thank you for your help, Sergeant Jackson." The bombing continued for nearly an hour, the sounds of explosions punctuated by the anti-aircraft fire of American defenses. The cellar became increasingly crowded as more townspeople sought shelter. Children cried, elderly people prayed quietly, and the atmosphere grew thick with fear and the cloying scent of too many bodies in too small a space. Throughout it all, Sergeant Jackson remained a steadying presence. He organized the available space to accommodate the growing numbers, distributed water from a barrel in the corner, and even produced chocolate bars from his pockets for the most frightened children. Marie watched him with growing admiration, struck by how effectively he took charge of the situation, despite being a stranger in a foreign land. When the all clear finally sounded, Jackson helped Marie up the narrow stairs and back into the light of day. The town square had been transformed in the brief but intense attack. Several buildings were now smoking ruins, and debris littered the once pristine snow. American medics and soldiers were already at work, treating the injured and beginning the process of clearing the damage. "I need to report back to my unit," Jackson said, surveying the destruction with a practiced eye. "Can you make it home, or should I find someone to assist you?" "I can manage," Marie assured him, testing her weight on her injured leg. The pain was considerable but bearable. "My cottage is not far." Jackson seemed reluctant to leave her, but nodded in acknowledgement of his duty. "The Germans will be back," he said, his voice low. "This was just the beginning. You should consider leaving Bastogne while you still can. This is my home, Marie replied simply. Where would I go? Before Jackson could respond, an army jeep pulled up nearby and Captain Miller called out to him. Jackson, command center now. The whole damn German army is on the move. With a final nod to Marie, Sergeant Jackson jogged toward the jeep, his tall figure soon disappearing around a corner. Marie stood for a moment watching until he was out of sight, then slowly began the painful journey home, unaware that their paths would cross again under even more dire circumstances. Captain Robert Miller sat behind a map-covered desk in what had once been the mayor's office, now serving as the command center for American forces in Bastogne. Intelligence reports were piling up, each one more concerning than the last. German panzer divisions were converging on the Ardennes region in numbers that suggested a major offensive was underway. They're throwing everything they have at us, Miller said, gesturing to the map where red pins indicated known German positions. This isn't just a probing action, it's a full-scale counter-offensive. Sergeant Jackson studied the map intently, mentally calculating supply needs against their current inventory. As a logistics specialist, his primary concern was whether they had sufficient ammunition, medical supplies, and rations to withstand what was coming. Our supply lines to the north have been cut, Jackson observed, tracing a route with his finger. And here to the east, German armor has already penetrated 5 miles into our territory. If they continue at this rate, we'll be completely surrounded within 48 hours. Miller nodded grimly. General McAuliffe is aware. Orders are to hold Bastogne at all costs. Its strategic location controls 7 major roads in the region. If we lose it, the entire Allied advance could be compromised. Jackson's expression remained neutral, though his mind was racing through calculations and contingencies. Current supplies can sustain full combat operations for approximately 3 days. After that, without airdrops, we'll be forced to ration severely. Then we pray for clear weather, Miller replied, glancing toward the window where heavy snow continued to fall. The forecast shows this system continuing for at least the next 4 days. No air support, no supply drops until it clears. The implications were clear to everyone in the room. They were about to be surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from supplies in the middle of one of the harshest winters Belgium had experienced in decades. The situation was dire by any military standard. There's another matter, Miller continued, lowering his voice slightly. Your presence here, Jackson, it's complicated things. Jackson remained expressionless, though his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Sir, I've received word from division headquarters. All non-essential personnel are to be evacuated before the German noose closes completely. That includes specialized units on temporary assignment. Miller's eyes met Jackson's directly. That means you, Sergeant. With respect, sir, there's nothing non-essential about ensuring this command has the supplies it needs to hold this position, Jackson replied evenly. If Bastogne is as critical as you say, then every man will be needed, regardless of his usual assignment. Miller sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. It's not about your abilities, Jackson. You know that. It's about the complications if you're captured. The Germans have been known to treat captured Negro soldiers differently. There are concerns at higher levels. The unspoken reality hung in the air between them. The German propaganda machine had made specific efforts to target black American servicemen, attempting to exploit racial tensions and suggesting they would receive better treatment than their white counterparts if they surrendered or defected. While these efforts had largely failed, they had created additional concerns among Allied leadership about the potential intelligence risks of having black troops in certain positions captured. I'm a Marine, sir, Jackson said simply. I accepted all risks when I enlisted. Miller studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, I'll inform Division that your expertise is essential to our operation here. You'll remain as our logistics coordinator. He gestured to the map again. Now let's figure out how to make 3 days of supplies last for what might be a much longer siege. For the next several hours, Sergeant Jackson immersed himself in the complex task of inventorying and redistributing the available supplies throughout the American positions in and around Bastogne. His methodical approach and remarkable memory for details proved invaluable as they prepared for the coming siege. It was past midnight when Jackson finally emerged from the command center, his breath forming clouds in the frigid night air. The snowfall had intensified, and an eerie silence had settled over the town, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional vehicle moving through the streets. German forces were drawing closer by the hour, and the window for evacuation was rapidly closing. Instead of heading directly to his assigned quarters, Jackson found himself walking through the deserted streets, his mind still processing the logistics challenges ahead. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and even his heavy wool uniform provided limited protection against the bitter cold. As he passed near the town square, a flicker of movement caught his attention. A solitary figure was struggling to carry what appeared to be a heavy bucket across the icy cobblestones. Even in the dim light, Jackson recognized Marie Dupont. Without hesitation, he changed direction and approached her. "Mademoiselle Dupont," he called softly, "let me help you with that." Marie startled at his voice, nearly dropping the bucket. "Sergeant Jackson," she said, recognizing him, "you should not be out in this cold." "Nor should you," he replied, gently taking the bucket from her hands. It was filled with water, presumably from the town well, since many homes had lost their water supply in the recent bombing. "Where are you staying?" "Still in my cottage," she said, pointing toward the eastern edge of town. "The bombing damaged the roof, but it remains safer than most alternatives." Jackson frowned. "The eastern approach is where the German advance is strongest. You should relocate to the western side of town." "And abandon my family home to looters or artillery?" Marie shook her head firmly. "I have protected it this long. I will continue to do so." Her determination was evident in the set of her jaw and the unwavering tone of her voice. Jackson recognized the futility of arguing and instead focused on the immediate task. "Then let me carry this for you," he said, already moving in the direction she had indicated. "How is your leg?" "Painful, but healing," Marie replied, falling into step beside him despite her limp. "Your field medicine skills are impressive." They walked in companionable silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crunch of their boots in the fresh snow and the distant echoes of military activity. Jackson found himself studying Marie's profile in the moonlight that occasionally broke through the clouds. There was a resilience in her features that reminded him of his own mother, a woman who had faced adversity with quiet strength throughout her life in segregated Louisiana. "May I ask you something, Sergeant?" Marie said, suddenly breaking the silence. "William," he corrected gently, "and yes, you may." "William," she repeated, as if testing the name. "Why are you here? I have noticed there are very few Negro soldiers among the Americans, and I am told that Negro Marines are even more rare, especially in Europe." Jackson considered his response carefully. The question touched on complex realities of race and military policy that were difficult to explain even to fellow Americans, let alone to a Belgian civilian. "I have certain skills that were needed here," he said finally. "The Marine Corps is still adjusting to having men like me in its ranks, but the war doesn't always allow for policies to dictate practical needs." Marie nodded thoughtfully. "The Germans dropped leaflets last year, saying that Negro American soldiers should surrender to them for better treatment, that they were fighting for people who did not even treat them as equals." Jackson's expression hardened slightly. German propaganda. They tried the same approach with Japanese Americans and others. They fail to understand that fighting for one's country is about more than how that country treats you in the moment. It's about what that country can become. They had reached Marie's cottage, a small stone structure with a partially damaged roof that had been covered with a tarpaulin. Jackson set the water bucket down near the door. "You should come inside for a moment to warm yourself," Marie offered, pushing the door open. "I have coffee, real coffee that one of your American supply sergeants traded for a bottle of my father's aged brandy." The invitation was tempting, not least because the temperature continued to drop, and Jackson's quarters were on the opposite side of town. Still, he hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety that might be perceived if he was seen entering a single woman's home at night, especially given the additional complications of his race. Marie seemed to sense his hesitation. "The neighbors evacuated 3 days ago," she said simply. "There is no one left to gossip, and we are both adults who have seen enough of war to know that social conventions are luxuries we can ill afford." Her pragmatism broke through his reserve, and Jackson nodded, following her into the modest cottage. The interior was neat but sparse, with simple wooden furniture arranged around a small fireplace that provided the only heat. Marie immediately set about preparing coffee on the small stove in the corner, while Jackson stood awkwardly near the door, his tall frame seeming too large for the humble space. "Please sit," Marie gestured to a chair near the fire. "You must be exhausted. The American officers have been in meetings all day and night." Jackson removed his helmet, but remained standing. "We're preparing for a siege," he said, deciding that honesty was warranted given the danger she faced by remaining. "The German forces will surround Bastogne completely within a day or two. Once that happens, no one will be able to leave." Marie continued preparing the coffee, her back to him. "I know," she said quietly. "The baker told me before he left with his family yesterday. I have made my choice." "It's not safe," Jackson pressed. "The last convoy heading west leaves at dawn. You could be on it." Marie turned to face him, her expression a complex mixture of determination and vulnerability. "This house is all I have left of my family, of my life before the war. I have already lost my husband to the Germans. I will not lose my home as well." The mention of her husband caught Jackson by surprise, though he was careful not to show it. He had assumed she was unmarried given her use of mademoiselle rather than madame. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. Marie nodded in acknowledgement as she poured the coffee into two mismatched cups. Etienne was taken in the first year of occupation. He was part of the resistance. I never learned exactly what happened to him, only that he did not survive interrogation. She handed Jackson a cup. "So, you see, Sergeant William Jackson, I have already faced the worst the Germans can do to me. Staying in my home holds no additional fear." Jackson accepted the coffee, feeling the weight of her words and the quiet courage they represented. For a brief moment, the war and all its complications seemed to recede, leaving just two people sharing coffee in a small cottage while snow fell outside. "Tell me about America," Marie said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "Is it truly as vast and varied as they say?" For the next hour, Jackson found himself describing his homeland to Marie, from the humid bayous of Louisiana, where he was born, to the bustling streets of Chicago, where he had worked before the war. He told her about Harlem and its vibrant culture, about the Grand Canyon, which he had visited while training in Arizona, and about the towering redwoods of California, which he had seen just before shipping out with the Marines. In turn, Marie spoke of pre-war Belgium, of the festivals in Brussels, and the simple pleasures of rural life in the Ardennes. She described her childhood in Bastogne with a wistfulness that made the small cottage seem momentarily filled with the ghosts of happier times. As their conversation continued, the distinct sound of artillery grew closer, a reminder of the reality that waited outside. Jackson glanced at his watch and realized he had stayed far longer than intended. "I must return to my post," he said reluctantly, rising from his chair. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation. Both were greatly needed." Marie walked him to the door. "Will I see you again, William?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was prepared to fully acknowledge. The circumstances of war created strange intimacies between strangers, connections that might never have formed in peacetime. "I hope so," Jackson replied honestly. "But the coming days will be difficult. Stay inside as much as possible. The safest place will be your cellar if you have one." "I do," she confirmed. "It is small but solid." Jackson nodded, satisfied. At the doorway he hesitated, then reached into his pocket and removed a small notebook and pencil. He quickly wrote something down, tore out the page, and handed it to her. "This is the frequency for emergency American communications. If you have a radio and the situation becomes desperate, broadcast on this channel. Include the code word Bayou so they'll know I sent you." Marie carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her dress pocket. "Thank you, William." With a final nod, Jackson stepped back into the snowy night, the warmth of the cottage and Marie's presence quickly giving way to the harsh reality of war. As he made his way back toward his post, He found himself hoping that Marie would reconsider and take the morning convoy out of Bastogne. Yet he already knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that she would remain regardless of the danger. The following day brought the full fury of the German offensive. Panzer divisions attacked from multiple directions, their advance slowed but not halted by the determined American defense and the difficult terrain. By nightfall, the last open road out of Bastogne had been cut, and the siege that would become one of the most famous standoffs of the war had officially begun. Within the American command center, organized chaos reigned as units reported their positions, casualties, and ammunition status. Sergeant Jackson worked tirelessly, coordinating the increasingly precious supplies and ensuring that every unit received what it needed most urgently. His system for tracking and distributing resources quickly proved invaluable, earning him the respect of officers who might otherwise have questioned the presence of a black Marine in such a crucial role. "We're down to 80% ammunition for the heavy artillery," Jackson reported to Captain Miller during a brief lull in the fighting. "Medical supplies are at 60%, with morphine critically low. Food rations can sustain current personnel for approximately 5 days if we implement the reduced schedule I proposed." Miller nodded grimly, making notes on his clipboard. "And fuel." 53%, sir. "I've implemented strict conservation measures, but the cold is forcing us to use more than anticipated to prevent equipment failure." The weather had continued to deteriorate, with temperatures dropping to record lows and snow accumulating to depths that made movement increasingly difficult. The same conditions that hampered their operations also prevented Allied aircraft from providing air support or dropping much-needed supplies. "The men are calling this the coldest winter in Belgian history," Miller commented, rubbing his hands together for warmth despite the small stove in the corner of the room. "The locals say it's the worst since 1916. Jackson thought of Marie in her damaged cottage and hoped her fireplace was providing adequate heat. He had not seen her since that night they shared coffee, his duties keeping him confined to the command center and various supply depots around town. "Sir," Jackson said after a moment's hesitation, "I'd like to conduct a check of the civilian population remaining in the eastern sector. We need to assess potential resource needs and identify any structures that might be repurposed if our current positions become untenable." Miller looked up from his paperwork, studying Jackson's face. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that Belgian woman you helped during the bombing, would it?" Jackson maintained his professional demeanor despite his surprise at Miller's awareness. "She's one of approximately 30 civilians still in that sector, sir. Given that we've committed to defending this town, we have a responsibility to those civilians who chose to remain." Miller held Jackson's gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Take Corporal Peterson with you. Be back before 1700 hours. The Germans typically increase artillery fire after sunset." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir," Jackson replied, already mentally planning the most efficient route that would allow him to check on Marie while fulfilling his stated mission. Corporal James Peterson was a lanky farm boy from Minnesota who had been assigned to assist Jackson with logistics. Despite initial awkwardness, the two had developed a solid working relationship based on mutual respect for competence. Peterson asked no questions when Jackson directed their patrol toward the eastern edge of town, though the young corporal maintained a vigilant watch for German snipers who had begun infiltrating the American lines. The scene that greeted them as they approached Marie's cottage caused Jackson's heart to sink. A mortar shell had struck the building next door, and the resulting fire had spread to Marie's roof. The tarpaulin that had covered the previous damage was now completely gone, and most of the roof had collapsed into the upper floor. "Check the cellar," Jackson ordered, his voice tense as they approached the smoldering structure. The main door was blocked by debris, forcing them to circle around to where exterior cellar doors were typically located in these older Belgian homes. They found the cellar entrance partially buried under snow and roof tiles. Jackson and Peterson quickly cleared the debris, and Jackson pulled open the heavy wooden doors. "Marie?" he called into the darkness below. "Marie Dupont?" A moment of terrible silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of artillery. Then a voice responded weakly from the darkness. "William, is that you? Relief flooded through Jackson as he descended the narrow stairs, Peterson close behind with a flashlight. The cellar was cold and damp, with rough stone walls and a packed earth floor. Marie sat huddled in a corner, wrapped in several blankets. A small oil lamp provided minimal light and no heat. "Are you injured?" Jackson asked immediately, kneeling beside her. Marie shook her head, though her face was pale and her lips had a bluish tinge that indicated the early stages of hypothermia. "The house began burning several hours ago. I could not save anything." Her voice was steady despite the circumstances, that same quiet resilience that had struck Jackson from their first meeting. "We need to get her to the aid station," Peterson said, playing his flashlight around the cellar. "She can't stay here." Jackson nodded in agreement, already removing his outer jacket to wrap around Marie's shoulders. "Can you stand?" he asked her gently. Marie attempted to rise but stumbled, her legs numb from cold and inactivity. Without hesitation, Jackson lifted her into his arms, just as he had during the bombing of the marketplace. This time, however, she did not protest, but instead leaned against his chest, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. "Peterson, lead the way," Jackson ordered. "Most direct route to the aid station." As they emerged from the cellar, the full extent of the destruction became clear. Marie's family home was now little more than a smoldering shell, the stone walls still standing, but everything within destroyed by fire or exposed to the elements. Marie glanced at the ruins, and though she made no sound, Jackson felt her body tense in his arms. "I am sorry," he said quietly, following her gaze to the destroyed cottage. "Truly sorry." Marie closed her eyes briefly, then looked directly at him. "Things can be rebuilt," she said, her voice barely audible, "if one survives." They made their way carefully through the snowy streets, avoiding open areas that might be targeted by German artillery or snipers. Peterson led them through alleyways and behind buildings, taking a circuitous route that prioritized safety over speed. Throughout the journey, Jackson was acutely aware of Marie's weight in his arms, of her gradual warming against his body, and of the trust implied by her unquestioning acceptance of his help. The aid station had been established in what was once a school, its thick walls and central location making it ideal for medical operations. As they entered, they were met with the organized chaos of a combat medical facility. Wounded soldiers on stretchers and makeshift beds, medics moving quickly between patients, the sharp scent of antiseptic barely masking the underlying smells of blood and fear. "Civilian hypothermia, no apparent injuries," Jackson reported to the first medic he encountered. Reluctantly transferring Marie to a stretcher, 2 orderlies brought forward. The medic, a tired-looking captain with the Medical Corps insignia, gave Marie a quick assessment. "Get her to warming station 3, he ordered the orderlies. "Standard protocol for hypothermia." As the orderlies began to move Marie away, she suddenly reached out and grasped Jackson's hand. "William," she said urgently. "Thank you." Jackson squeezed her hand gently. "I'll check on you when I can," he promised, though both knew that his duties might make that impossible in the current circumstances. Marie nodded in understanding, releasing his hand, as the orderlies continued toward the designated treatment area. Jackson watched until they disappeared behind a partition, then turned to Peterson. "We still need to complete our assessment of the eastern sector," he said, returning to his professional demeanor despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "Let's move." For the next 3 days, the siege of Bastogne intensified. German artillery pounded the American positions relentlessly, while infantry and armored units probed for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. The bitter cold claimed nearly as many casualties as enemy fire, with frostbite and exposure becoming serious concerns as fuel supplies dwindled. Through it all, the American forces held firm, bolstered by the now famous response of General Anthony McAuliffe to the German surrender demand. Nuts. Sergeant William Jackson's logistics system was credited with helping maintain the defense despite dwindling supplies. His methodical approach to inventory and distribution ensured that nothing was wasted and that critical needs were met first. When limited supplies of morphine threatened the care of the wounded, it was Jackson who devised a rotation system that stretched the available stock while prioritizing the most severely injured. On the 4th day of the siege, December 21st, The skies finally cleared enough for Allied aircraft to attempt supply drops. The sight of American C-47 transport planes flying overhead brought cheers from the beleaguered defenders, even as German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Colorful parachutes blossomed against the blue sky as containers of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations descended into the American lines. Sergeant Jackson coordinated the recovery teams, ensuring that the precious supplies were collected quickly and distributed according to the most urgent needs. The sudden influx of resources transformed the situation from desperate to manageable, though the siege itself showed no signs of lifting. It was late in the evening when Jackson finally found time to visit the aid station. The medical facility had expanded to occupy nearly the entire school building, with wounded men occupying every available space. Civilian patients had been segregated to a small classroom on the ground floor, which now housed approximately 15 Belgian citizens who had been injured or, like Marie, displaced by the fighting. The room was dimly lit by kerosene lamps to conserve electricity for critical medical equipment. Jackson paused in the doorway, scanning the rows of makeshift beds until he located Marie near a window. She appeared to be sleeping, her face peaceful despite the circumstances. For a moment, he considered leaving without disturbing her, but as he turned to go, her eyes opened. "William," she said, her voice stronger than it had been when he last saw her. "You came." Jackson moved to her bedside, conscious of the curious glances from other patients. A Black American Marine visiting a Belgian woman was unusual enough to draw attention, even in the midst of a siege. "How are you feeling?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Much better," Marie replied, sitting up in the narrow bed. She was dressed in borrowed clothes. A sweater several sizes too large, over what appeared to be a standard-issue military undershirt. "The doctors say I can leave tomorrow. They need the space for more serious cases." Jackson nodded, understanding the practical necessity, even as he worried about where she would go. "Do you have somewhere to stay? Friends in town, perhaps?" Marie shook her head. "Most have evacuated or are in similar circumstances, but the nurses mentioned that the church basement has been converted to a shelter for displaced townspeople. I will go there." The church basement was overcrowded and inadequately heated, offering little privacy and minimal comfort. The thought of Marie in such conditions troubled Jackson, though he knew millions across Europe were facing far worse. "I might be able to arrange something better," he said after a moment's consideration. "One of the supply sergeants has commandeered a small apartment above the bakery on Rue du Marché. It's being used to store non-critical supplies that I could easily relocate." Marie studied his face in the dim light. "Why would you do this for me? William, you barely know me." It was a fair question, one that Jackson had asked himself repeatedly over the past few days. His concern for Marie went beyond professional duty or basic human compassion, but articulating the nature of his interest was complicated by the realities they both faced. A Black American serviceman and a Belgian widow in the midst of war. "I believe people should help one another when they can," he said finally, "especially in times like these. The apartment would be yours alone, not something we would share," he added quickly, wanting to ensure his intentions weren't misinterpreted. A small smile crossed Marie's face. "I did not assume otherwise, William. Your character has been evident from our first meeting." She reached out and briefly touched his hand. "I would be grateful for your help." The following morning, Jackson arranged for Marie's relocation to the apartment above the bakery. The space was modest, a single room with a small attached kitchen, but it was private and, most importantly, had a functioning wood stove. Jackson personally delivered an initial supply of firewood, along with rations that could be prepared without electricity, which had become increasingly unreliable throughout the town. "It isn't much," he apologized, as Marie surveyed her new accommodations. "It is palace compared to the church basement," she replied with genuine appreciation. "Or my cellar." Over the next several days, as the siege continued and the situation in Bastogne remained precarious, Jackson found legitimate reasons to check on the supply storage in adjacent rooms, which inevitably led to brief visits with Marie. Their conversations, necessarily short due to Jackson's duties, became a small oasis of normality in the chaos of war. Marie told him more about her life before the German occupation, her brief marriage to Etienne, her work as a schoolteacher, her dreams of traveling to Paris, and perhaps one day to America. In turn, Jackson shared stories of his childhood in Louisiana, his struggle to obtain an education in segregated schools, and his decision to enlist despite knowing he would face discrimination even in uniform. On Christmas Eve, a particularly heavy bombardment kept Jackson at the command center throughout the night. The German forces seemed determined to break the American lines before Christmas Day, perhaps hoping that holiday sentiments might weaken resolve. Instead, the defenders fought with renewed determination, knowing that General Patton's relief forces were drawing closer each day. It was mid-morning on Christmas Day when Jackson finally left the command center, exhausted after nearly 20 hours of continuous duty. The bombardment had ceased around dawn, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost as unsettling as the shelling. Snow had begun falling again, covering the scars of battle with a deceptively peaceful blanket of white. Instead of heading to his assigned quarters for much-needed rest, Jackson found himself walking toward the bakery and Marie's apartment. He had managed to save a small package of real coffee from the recent supply drop, a luxury worth its weight in gold under current conditions, and had decided it would make an appropriate Christmas gift. The streets were largely deserted, most soldiers either on duty at the perimeter or taking advantage of the lull to rest. As Jackson approached the bakery, he noticed smoke rising from the apartment's chimney, a reassuring sign that Marie was staying warm despite the plummeting temperatures. He climbed the exterior stairs to the apartment door and knocked gently. After a moment, Marie opened the door, surprise giving way to pleasure as she recognized him. "William, Joyeux Noël," she greeted him, stepping aside to let him enter. "I did not expect to see anyone today." "Merry Christmas," he replied, removing his helmet as he stepped inside. The apartment was warm from the wood stove, and Marie had managed to create a semblance of holiday atmosphere with sprigs of evergreen arranged on the small table and a hand-drawn star affixed to the window. "I brought you something," Jackson said, somewhat awkwardly producing the package of coffee from his pocket. "It's not much of a Christmas gift, but it is perfect," Marie interrupted, accepting the package with genuine delight. "Real coffee is better than any fancy gift. Please sit while I prepare some for us." Jackson sat at the small table while Marie busied herself with the coffee preparation. He was struck by how comfortable the scene felt, how reminiscent of normality despite the war raging just beyond the walls. There was something both poignant and affirming about this simple domestic moment amid so much destruction. "I have something for you as well," Marie said as she set the coffee pot on the stove. From a drawer in the table, she removed a small, carefully wrapped package. "It is not as practical as coffee, but perhaps it will bring you some comfort." Jackson accepted the package with surprise. "You didn't need to give me anything." "It is Christmas," she said simply. "Even in war, some traditions should be maintained." He unwrapped the package to find a hand-knitted scarf in dark blue wool. The stitching was neat and even, the wool soft despite its practical weight. "I found the wool in one of the storage rooms," Marie explained. "I asked the supply sergeant if I could use a small amount, and he agreed. I have been working on it in the evenings." Jackson ran his fingers over the careful stitches, deeply moved by both the gift itself and the thought behind it. In the segregated Marine Corps, personal kindnesses were rare enough. In war-torn Belgium, from a woman who had lost almost everything, such generosity was extraordinary. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will treasure this." Marie smiled, turning her attention back to the coffee that had begun to boil. "It is a practical gift. Belgian winters are harsh, especially this year." They shared the coffee in companionable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The relative peace was interrupted by the distant sound of artillery, not the German batteries they had grown accustomed to, but American artillery firing outward from their positions. "Patton," Jackson said, recognizing the significance of the changed artillery pattern. His forces must be engaging the German lines to the south. The knowledge that relief might finally be near hung in the air between them, bringing with it the unspoken awareness that Jackson's time in Bastogne would soon end. Once the siege was lifted, regular supply lines would be re-established and his specialized services would be needed elsewhere. "What will happen when the siege ends?" Marie asked, giving voice to the question they had both been avoiding. Jackson looked down at his coffee cup, considering his answer carefully. "The logistics corps will be reorganized. Those of us on special assignment will likely be reassigned according to the needs of the European theater. And Negro Marines are still primarily serving in the Pacific," Marie said, demonstrating her understanding of the complex racial policies of the American military. "Yes," Jackson confirmed. "Once the immediate crisis here is resolved, I expect I'll be transferred back to a supply unit in England, and from there possibly to the Pacific." Marie nodded, her expression composed despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "War makes for strange meetings and sudden partings." "It does," Jackson agreed. "But some meetings leave a mark that remains long after the parting." Their eyes met across the table, an unspoken current of understanding passing between them. In another time, in another place, perhaps something might have developed between them. Here now they both recognized the impossibility of such a path, yet neither regretted the connection they had formed. The moment was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps on the stairs, followed by an urgent knock at the door. Jackson rose quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "Sergeant Jackson?" a voice called. "Message from Captain Miller. You're needed at the command center immediately." Jackson opened the door to find a young private standing there, out of breath from running. "What's happening, Private?" "German armor, sir, a major push from the east. Captain says to tell you it's urgent." Jackson nodded, immediately shifting back into his professional role. "Tell the captain I'm on my way." He turned back to Marie, who was already gathering his helmet and the new scarf. "You must go," she said, handing him his things. "Thank you for the coffee and the company." Jackson accepted his helmet, but hesitated before taking the scarf. Making a sudden decision, he reached for the dog tags around his neck. All Marines wore two, one for identification if they were killed, the other to remain with the body. He removed one of the tags from the chain and pressed it into Marie's hand. "Keep this," he said quietly. "If we don't see each other again, it's something to remember our meeting by." Marie looked down at the metal tag in her palm, then closed her fingers around it tightly. "I will keep it safe," she promised. "And you, keep yourself safe, William Jackson." With a final nod, Jackson placed his helmet on his head and followed the private down the stairs and into the snowy street, where the sounds of battle were growing more intense by the minute. As he jogged toward the command center, he found himself hoping that this would not be their final meeting, even as military reality told him it likely would be. The German offensive that day was their final major push to break through the Bastogne perimeter. It was repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides, the American defenders holding their positions despite dwindling ammunition and the physical toll of prolonged combat in severe winter conditions. 2 days later, on December 26th, the first elements of General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and reached the beleaguered defenders. The siege of Bastogne was officially lifted, though fighting in the broader Ardennes region would continue for several more weeks. For Sergeant William Jackson, the end of the siege brought the expected orders: immediate transfer to a supply depot in England, where his logistics expertise was needed to support the ongoing Allied advance. The rapid pace of military redeployment left no time for personal farewells. On his last evening in Bastogne, Jackson wrote a letter to Marie, explaining his sudden departure and expressing his hope that she would rebuild her life once the war ended. He entrusted the letter to Corporal Peterson, who promised to deliver it personally. Whether that delivery ever took place, Jackson would not learn for many years. The remaining months of the war passed in a blur of activity for Jackson. From England, he was indeed transferred to the Pacific Theater, where he joined one of the segregated marine ammunition companies supporting operations in the Philippines and preparations for the anticipated invasion of Japan. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to an unexpected and abrupt conclusion, altering deployment plans throughout the Pacific. Sergeant William Jackson was honorably discharged from the United States Marine Corps in February 1946. He returned to America that had been transformed by war, yet remained stubbornly unchanged in its treatment of black citizens. Despite his service and decorations, he found many doors still closed to him because of his race. Leveraging his military logistics experience, Jackson eventually secured a position with a shipping company in Baltimore, where he established himself as an exceptional operations manager. He married Loretta Wilson, a schoolteacher, in 1948, and they raised 3 children together in a modest home in a segregated neighborhood on the city's west side. As the years passed, Jackson rarely spoke of his wartime experiences. Like many veterans, he preferred to focus on building his future rather than dwelling on the past. But occasionally, on cold winter nights when snow fell outside their Baltimore home, his thoughts would return to Bastogne and to the Belgian woman who had knitted him a scarf during one of the most desperate battles of the war. Marie Dupont remained in Bastogne after the war, working to rebuild both her life and her community from the devastation left by the Ardennes offensive. The cottage that had been her family home proved beyond repair, but with determination and the assistance of reconstruction programs, she eventually established a small bookshop in the town center. In 1947, she married Pierre Laurent, a widower who had lost his wife during the German occupation. Their daughter Isabelle was born the following year, a symbol of renewal amid the continuing recovery from war. Marie never spoke to her husband about William Jackson or the American dog tag she kept in a small wooden box alongside her first husband's wedding ring and a few other treasured mementos. Life in post-war Belgium settled into a routine of gradual improvement as the Marshall Plan and other reconstruction efforts helped rebuild the shattered European economies. Marie's bookshop prospered modestly, becoming something of a cultural center in the rejuvenated Bastogne. She followed news of America with particular interest, especially reports about the civil rights movement that began gaining momentum in the 1950s. When Isabelle Laurent turned 18 in 1966, Marie finally shared with her daughter the story of the siege of Bastogne and the Black Marine who had saved her life twice during those desperate days. She showed Isabelle the dog tag, its metal surface now tarnished with age, but the embossed information still legible. Jackson, William D. USMC. Isabelle, who had grown up hearing heroic stories about the American liberation of Belgium, but very few personal accounts from her reserved mother, was fascinated by this glimpse into Marie's experiences during the war. A university student with plans to study international relations, Isabelle had already developed a keen interest in American society and politics, particularly the ongoing struggle for civil rights. "Have you ever tried to contact him?" Isabelle asked her mother. "To let him know you survived the war?" Marie shook her head. "The letter he sent said he was being transferred to the Pacific. After that, I had no way to reach him. And then I met your father, and life moved forward as it must." Isabelle studied the dog tag thoughtfully. "But you kept this all these years." "Some kindnesses should never be forgotten," Marie replied simply, "especially those that come when all seems darkest." The conversation might have ended there, becoming just another family story shared and then set aside. But Isabelle Laurent had inherited her mother's quiet determination, along with a younger generation's belief in taking action rather than accepting circumstances. In the summer of 1966, Isabelle applied for and was accepted into a student exchange program that would send her to the United States for 1 academic year. Her assigned destination was Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. A coincidence that Marie noted with a raised eyebrow when the acceptance letter arrived. "Perhaps it is not entirely coincidence," Isabelle admitted. "I requested placement on the East Coast. Baltimore was one of several possibilities." Marie regarded her daughter with knowing eyes. "And will you look for him while you are there, after 20 years? "Would you mind if I did?" Isabelle asked, suddenly uncertain. "It is your story, after all." Marie was silent for a moment, her thoughts turning back across the years to those few brief encounters during the desperate winter of 1944. "No," she said finally. "I would not mind. If you find him, tell him I kept his dog tag safe as promised." In September 1966, Isabelle Laurent arrived in Baltimore, her official purpose being to study American political systems at Johns Hopkins University. Unofficially, she had set herself the task of locating a former Marine named William Jackson in a city of nearly 1 million people, with nothing but a 20-year-old dog tag and her mother's memories to guide her. The search proved more difficult than she had anticipated. Post-war record-keeping was inconsistent, and many veterans had relocated multiple times after returning home. The additional complications of racial segregation in Baltimore made her inquiries in certain neighborhoods more challenging. As a young white European woman, asking questions about a black veteran occasionally raised suspicions. After several weeks of dead ends and false leads, Isabel's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a class discussion about the civil rights movement, she mentioned her interest in the experiences of black servicemen during World War II. Her professor, Dr. Thomas Mitchell, had worked with the Veterans History Project and offered to help her access their records. "They've been collecting oral histories and documenting veteran experiences," Dr. Mitchell explained. "If your Marine served with distinction in Bastogne, he might be in their files." The Veterans History Project did indeed have a record for William D. Jackson, former Marine sergeant who had served in both the European and Pacific theaters. Most significantly, the file contained a current address in West Baltimore, where Jackson still lived with his wife and was now working as a logistics manager for the Port of Baltimore. On a crisp autumn day in October 1966, Isabelle Laurent found herself standing on the sidewalk outside a well-maintained two-story home in a predominantly black neighborhood of West Baltimore. The street was lined with similar houses, their small front yards neatly kept despite the urban setting. Children played on the sidewalks while mothers watched from porches, their curious glances making Isabelle acutely aware of her status as an obvious outsider. Gathering her courage, Isabelle approached the house and knocked on the door. After a moment, it was opened by a woman in her early 40s with a warm face and questioning eyes. "Mrs. Jackson?" Isabelle asked tentatively. "Yes," the woman confirmed, her expression curious but not unwelcoming. "Can I help you?" "My name is Isabelle Laurent. I'm from Belgium," Isabelle explained, her English accented but fluent. "I'm looking for William Jackson, who served in Bastogne during the war. My mother, Marie Dupont, now Marie Laurent, asked me to find him." A flash of recognition crossed Mrs. Jackson's face, followed by an unreadable expression that might have been concern or simply surprise. Before she could respond, a deep voice called from within the house. "Loretta, who's at the door?" "You might want to come see for yourself, William," Loretta Jackson replied, her eyes still on Isabelle. A moment later, William Jackson appeared in the doorway beside his wife. At 48, he retained the impressive height and broad shoulders that Marie had described to her daughter, though his hair was now flecked with grey at the temples. He studied Isabelle with evident confusion, clearly trying to determine if he should recognize this young European woman on his doorstep. "Mr. Jackson," Isabelle began, suddenly nervous now that the moment had actually arrived. "My name is Isabelle Laurent. My mother is Marie Dupont from Bastogne. You saved her life during the siege in 1944. Jackson's expression transformed instantly from confusion to astonishment. "Marie Dupont," he repeated, the name clearly triggering a flood of memories. "She survived the war." "Yes," Isabelle confirmed. "She wanted you to know that she kept her promise." From her purse, she withdrew a small box and opened it to reveal the tarnished dog tag. "She kept this safe all these years." Jackson stared at the dog tag in stunned silence, then looked back at Isabelle's face, searching for traces of the woman he had known briefly more than 2 decades earlier. "Please," Loretta Jackson said, breaking the momentary silence. "Come inside, Miss Laurent. I think you and my husband have much to discuss." The Jackson home was comfortably furnished, with photographs of family members displayed prominently on the walls and shelves. Isabelle noted pictures of 3 children at various ages, a daughter who appeared to be in college now and 2 younger sons. There were also several framed certificates and awards related to Jackson's military service and subsequent civilian career. Over coffee in their living room, Isabelle relayed her mother's story since the war, her rebuilding of her life in Bastogne, her marriage to Pierre Laurent, the bookshop she now ran in the town centre. In turn, William Jackson shared his experiences after leaving Belgium, his return to civilian life in a still segregated America, and his ongoing work at the Port of Baltimore. "Your mother's kindness stayed with me," Jackson said, the dog tag now resting in his palm. "That Christmas in Bastogne, amid all that chaos and destruction, she managed to create a moment of humanity. It reminded me what we were fighting for. She said the same about you, Isabel replied, that you showed kindness when it would have been easier not to care about one Belgian civilian among so many. Loretta Jackson, who had been listening quietly, placed her hand over her husband's. William has always been that way. Seeing the individual behind the statistics, the person behind the logistics. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation expanded to include Jackson's children, who returned home from school and were introduced to their unexpected visitor from Belgium. The oldest, Catherine, was especially interested in Isabel's experiences as a university student in America and her impressions of the civil rights movement. "Things are changing," Catherine said with the passionate conviction of youth. "Not fast enough, but they're changing. My generation won't accept the limitations our parents faced." William Jackson looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern that Isabel recognized from her own father's expressions when she discussed her more ambitious plans. "Change comes with a cost," Jackson said quietly. "But yes, things are changing. When I returned from the war, I couldn't even eat in the same restaurants as the white Marines I'd served alongside. Now, at least in some places, that's no longer true." As evening approached, Isabel reluctantly prepared to leave, aware that she had imposed on the Jackson family's hospitality for several hours. To her surprise, they insisted she stay for dinner, with Loretta declaring that any daughter of Marie Dupont was welcome at their table. During dinner, William Jackson asked about Bastogne now, 2 decades after the desperate siege that had made the town a symbol of Allied determination. "It's prosperous again," Isabel told him. "There's a memorial to the American defenders, and every year on the anniversary of the siege, veterans return to commemorate those who fought there. The people of Bastogne have not forgotten. Perhaps someday I'll visit," Jackson said, though his tone suggested he considered it unlikely. For many black veterans, international travel remained complicated and expensive, particularly to regions where they had served during the war. As Isabel prepared to leave after dinner, William Jackson disappeared briefly into another room. He returned with a small, carefully preserved blue wool scarf. "Please give this to your mother," he said, handling the scarf with obvious care. "Tell her it kept me warm through the rest of that winter, just as she intended. And it reminded me that even in the worst circumstances, human connections matter." Isabel accepted the scarf with appropriate solemnity, recognizing it as the gift her mother had mentioned making for the Marine who had helped her. "I will give it to her, along with your message. And this," Jackson added, pressing something else into her hand. It was his remaining dog tag, the pair to the one Marie had kept all these years. "Tell her now we each have one, a matching set, across the ocean." The symbolism of the gesture, reuniting the separated dog tags after 20 years, yet keeping them divided between continents just as the people who held them remained, was not lost on Isabel. "I will tell her," she promised, "and I will write to let you know it was delivered safely." That evening marked the beginning of a correspondence that would continue for many years. Isabelle Laurent remained in contact with the Jackson family long after her return to Belgium, exchanging letters that chronicled major life events and changing times in both countries. William Jackson never did visit Bastogne again, but his daughter Catherine travelled to Belgium in 1974 and met Marie Laurent, by then a widow running her bookshop with Isabel's help. Marie and William exchanged their own letters occasionally, thoughtful, measured communications between two people who had shared a brief but significant connection during one of history's most consequential conflicts. Their correspondence never ventured into sentimentality or might-have-beens, but instead reflected on the lives they had built and the world that had emerged from the war they had experienced together. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, Marie Laurent received a package from Baltimore. William Jackson had passed away earlier that year, and his wife Loretta had found among his effects a sealed letter addressed to Marie Dupont, Bastogne, with instructions that it be sent in the event of his death. The letter, written in the careful hand of a man determined to leave nothing important unsaid, thanked Marie for her kindness during the siege and for the dignity with which she had treated him. Not as a black soldier, unusual and out of place, but simply as a fellow human being caught in the machinery of war. "In those few days in Bastogne," Jackson wrote, "you showed me a future that might be possible, one where people are judged by their actions rather than the color of their skin. I have worked toward that future throughout my life, and though it remains incomplete, progress has been made. Your friendship, brief as our time together was, gave me hope when hope was in short supply. For that, I remained grateful all my days." The letter was accompanied by a small box containing the blue scarf Marie had knitted so many years ago, now carefully preserved despite its age. Pinned to the scarf was the dog tag she had given to Isabelle, reunited at last with its pair. Marie Laurent, by then in her 70s, displayed the reunited dog tags and the preserved scarf in a small glass case in her bookshop. Beneath them, a simple placard read, "In memory of Sergeant William D. Jackson, USMC, Bastogne, December 1944. Some kindnesses should never be forgotten." Each year on the anniversary of the siege, Marie would place fresh flowers beside the display, a quiet tribute to a brief wartime connection that had resonated across decades and generations. In her final years, as her health began to fail, it was Isabelle who continued the tradition, understanding that her mother's experience with the Black Marine from America had shaped not only Marie's life but her own as well. The story of Marie Dupont and William Jackson might have remained simply a family memory, known only to those directly involved, had Isabelle not written an account of their connection for a Belgian historical journal in 2004. The article, titled "Dog Tags and Dignity, An Untold Story from the Siege of Bastogne," brought attention to the often overlooked contributions of Black American servicemen during the European campaign. The article was later translated into English and included in a Smithsonian exhibition on diversity in the American Armed Forces during World War II. Katherine Jackson, by then a professor of history specializing in civil rights, was invited to speak at the exhibition opening, where she reflected on her father's experience as one of the few Black Marines to serve in the European theater. "My father never considered himself a hero," Katherine told the audience. "He would say he was just doing his job, using the skills he had to support those on the front lines. But in finding humanity amid inhumanity, in treating a Belgian civilian with dignity when so many others saw only a logistical problem, he demonstrated the kind of quiet heroism that changes lives one person at a time." Today, in the Bastogne War Museum, a small display features replicas of William Jackson's dog tags alongside photographs of Marie Dupont-Laurent and Sergeant Jackson in later years. The accompanying text describes their brief but significant connection during one of the most desperate battles of World War II, and how that connection extended across decades through their children and grandchildren. Visitors to the museum often pause at this display, drawn by the personal nature of the story amid the broader historical narrative of armies and strategies. For many, it serves as a reminder that history is not merely a collection of dates and military engagements, but a tapestry of individual human experiences, some brief but profound, like the unexpected friendship between a Black American Marine and a Belgian woman during the frozen winter of 1944, a friendship commemorated by a pair of dog tags, separated by war but reunited by the next generation, each half kept safe as promised, through decades of change and challenge. A small but poignant testament to the connections that sustain humanity even in its darkest hours. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.